Part 1, The Social Forces. Chapter 1, Inequality in Modern Societies. Imagine an infuriated mob swarming the streets attempting to forcibly overturn the social structure of its country. Ask yourselves, what drives these people, motivating them to call for a revolution? In Cairo or New York, in Syria or Minneapolis, your answer will probably include in one way or another the concept of inequality. In 2003, I was midway through my doctorate. At the time, I was doing really well. I'd already published an article or two and wasn't too worried about the future. It's pretty rare in academia to get to the point where you're pleased with yourself because research is primarily a roller coaster of emotions. 1 minute you're successful, and a minute later you realize that everything you've done is worthy of the garbage can. And I'd also just fallen in love with a smart, pretty young woman whose name I can't remember, but for the book's sake, let's call her Anna. She, on the other hand, didn't see me even when I was there, right next to her. I'm not the type to give up easily, and a chance came along for us to fly together to India. So in the middle of my doctorate, and without telling my mentors a thing, I found myself trekking around India with the lovely lady. Dreamy. After spending a week together in northern India, a week in which I mainly worked at getting her to like me, and she mainly focused on giving me the brush off, we decided to head south for Rajasthan. This involved some 600 kilometers by slow trains, hitchhiking, and taxis. Without a whole lot of choice, we chatted. It turned out that Anna was the daughter of one of Israel's richest industrialists. Sadly, for me, I realized there was nothing we agreed on. To her, life was gray, disappointing, and rife with exploiters, whereas in my imagination, it was the complete opposite. Life was full of fascinating folk, most of whom I liked. And then came her real punch to my gut. As far as she was concerned, all residents of Israel's peripheries were losers for not taking their fate into their own hands, and their meager lives were solely their own faults. She couldn't understand why they didn't pack their stuff up right away and move to central Israel to make it in the big city. Inequality, from her point of view, was a question of choice. Nothing more. None of my statistical explanations helped. None of the social reasoning I presented made any impression. Nothing. As far as she was concerned, they were all losers. How can inequality be measured? There was one thing that Anna and I did agree on. Inequality is the unavoidable outcome of the nature of human society. Sociologists love to divide the concept of inequality into subsections, which lets them pen increasingly focused articles on each topic. But we're going to manage with two primary meanings of the term. Economic equality, being equality of income and ownership of assets, and equal opportunity, also known as social equality, being a state where each person in society receives an equal chance at developing their capabilities and financial standing. Let's go back to the image we started this chapter with, the seething mob demonstrating in the streets. And let's assume for now that inequality of both kinds is bothering them. The actual disparities in the distribution of wealth in society and the disparities in each citizen's potential to expand her or his personal share of the wealth. If indeed inequality is such a significant characteristic of a society in chaos, the first question we need to ask is, how much inequality is there in the world? To start out, let's explore and understand economic inequality. What is its source? How can it be measured? We'll travel the world a bit in order to clarify this, but first, a little background from the mountains of data provided by statistics bureaus that will help us comprehend the notion. If we're going to discuss inequality in society, we need an index. Let's assume that in a particular country there are 5 people who will list from left to right based on their incomes. Nathan, Naomi, Tammy, Joy, and Topaz. In other words, Topaz is the wealthiest and Nathan is the poorest. Now let's divide them into groups and calculate the sum total of income for each of the following groups. Nathan, Naomi, Nathan, Naomi, Tammy, Nathan, Naomi, Tammy, Joy, and lastly, Nathan, Naomi, Tammy, Joy, Topaz. We'll set out the incomes of these groups on an axis as we have done in the graph below. That gives us the curve seen in the lower dotted line. It's called the Lorenz curve. To those who are listening, I'll briefly describe illustration 1, as we shall do from now on for all illustrations in the book when needed. Illustration 1 is a graph known as the Lorenz curve, which starts with a slow rise, reflecting the wealth of the poorest individuals first, and then increases rapidly as it incorporates the wealthiest. A dotted straight line is also included in the illustration, beginning at 0 like the Lorenz curve and ending at the point where the Lorenz curve ends, but remaining above the Lorenz curve at all other points. What can we learn from this graph? Firstly, note that each addition of a person to the group adds a similar quantity of income until we get to topaz, and then the graph spikes upwards. In other words, just by looking at the graph, we can conclude that topaz has a much greater income than the others. How would the graph look if everyone earned around the same? We'd get a straight line like the upper one. It means that the addition of each person's income to the total would be identical. In other words, the more our Lorenz curve, the lower dotted line, is distanced from a straight line, the upper dotted line, the greater the inequality in society. The closeness of the Lorenz curve to the straight line is measured by an index called the Gini coefficient, which would be 0 for a completely egalitarian society. In a completely non-egalitarian society, where only one person holds all the assets, the coefficient would be 1. So the closer a country's Gini coefficient approaches 0, the less inequality that society will have. Although this form of measuring is limited and doesn't allow us to fully grasp the state of inequality, it's a good tool for conducting comparisons, which is why we'll use it. The global Gini coefficient average in our modern times is 0.6 to 0.7. In the second illustration, you see the coefficient on the map. The grayscale indicates this index in various countries at the time of writing. The US Gini coefficient is 0.48. Europe and Israel are in a relatively good position in 0.35, and both South America's and South Africa's positions are dreadful. The best known example of inequality is the Democratic Republic of Congo, controlled for 32 years by the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, whose real name is an accumulation of letters so long as to be mind-blowing, and means the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. It's almost too obvious to state that during Mobutu's rule, the people in Congo had difficulty finding food, whereas Mobutu's personal wealth stood at some $15 billion, and that was considered Congo's good period. You probably notice the non-uniform concentration of shades in illustration 2, and these disparities can't help but raise questions. But first, have a look at the curve in illustration 3, which presents historic Gini coefficients in various places worldwide for the past several centuries based on our current dollar value. The chart also shows the upper limits curve, which indicates the greatest possible level of inequality. The idea behind this upper limit curve is that in a very poor society, inequality can't be very high. That's because if the average income in that society is the minimum needed to survive, then inequality can't exist for any length of time, since a significant percentage of the population will die of starvation and therefore won't show anymore in the statistics. The illustration shows that some of these historic societies were close to the upper limit curve. In other words, their inequality was the highest it could possibly be. The Netherlands and England, by contrast, were more distanced from the limit. This implies that Western societies were more egalitarian from the historical perspective, and not just in the 21st century. It's worth investigating the reason for this. Does it derive from a better quality of population, or perhaps from a more complex reality? It might come as a surprise, but countries don't become rich because they've accumulated goods such as food, building materials, and so on. Sustainable wealth derives from organized production, marketing, and trade methods. For an efficient economic method of this kind to continue over the long term, it's important for the public to have trust in government institutions. That's why, as a general rule, revolutions and conquests don't benefit the development of sustainable wealth, irrespective of the fact that, for the most part, they don't end with any fairer allocation of the wealth. Stable and organized government was the method which the Roman Empire successfully applied towards achieving heightened peace and internal stability throughout the empire. Stability that commenced in 27 BCE, lasted for some 200 years, and is known as Pax Romana. There was no peace in the sense of non-combat because numerous wars were still conducted, but the pax, generally forced onto the local population, was a form of protection and economic collaboration among all subjects and social classes in the empire. It was a wonderful era for obedient subjects, to the degree that the renowned historian Edward Gibbon described it as the condition of the human race which was most happy and prosperous. Less obedient subjects, unsurprisingly, didn't view this period as particularly joyful. Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of the 19th century German Empire, understanding the power and advantages of this policy, pushed for the 1884 signing of the Berlin Conference Treaty, which sought to establish a similar system to Pax Romana. The treaty determined free trade regions, and Africa was subdivided among the European powers. Kenya, for example, became a British colony. Britain applied an accelerated process of modernization during which England moved thousands of white settlers there. They took control of the good lands, and the locals were forced off and into an area of limited size and quality. With no other choice, multitudes of Kenyans were forced into the colony's crowded cities, already suffering unemployment, to work for the whites. This and similar historic events across Africa are a significant reason behind the weak gray tone of these countries in the genie illustration. Colonization activities brought stability and prosperity to Europe, simultaneously creating waves that influenced inequality in African states to this day. Inequality in Brazil, 0.5 on the Gini coefficient, is also the result of a historic ripple effect. The forefathers of residents in Brazil's disconnected, backward Wild West were forcibly brought from Africa as slaves. Because of Brazil's massive size, it took a long time for Western Brazil to connect to the buzzing center in Rio de Janeiro, located in the east. Meanwhile, huge disparities developed between the populations. This ongoing process is the cause of Western Brazil's continued straggling behind Eastern Brazil. Take a look at India in illustration 3. During the time I was doing my doctoral studies, I had another romance with India when, together with 2 friends, we set up a dating site for Indians. Naively, we presumed that none of the 1.3 billion Indians had thought of that idea. We were sure we just discovered terra incognita. In our imaginations, the dollars flowing in were already fattening our bank accounts. Excitedly, we began working on the website, which at the time was a huge technological challenge. We launched the site celebrating. Thud. Not a single person registered. In retrospect, it turned out that there were already countless such sites, and in our sheer stupidity, we never thought to search for them before we got going on ours. So what's next? We read up a bit about India and decided to recast the site as exclusively for gay men. And that turned out to be a stunning success from which we earned not a single cent. That's when we realized that India is split into castes, and the social rules around intermingling among them were very harsh, to the point of prohibition of marriage and even physical contact. In this social fabric, homosexuals were beyond even these rules, on the furthest margins of society, and lacked any ability to pay for a dating site. The layering of Indian society, which had existed for centuries, was actually reinforced during British colonization. Britons ruled India initially through a trade company called the British East India Company, which maintained Indian traditions. When the company handed over governance to Queen Victoria, she wanted to maintain civilian quiet and applied legal validity to these social castes. By the way, Indian society at this time still accepted alarming practices of female oppression, such as the custom of sati infanticide, the intentional killing of female babies, and arranged marriages for child brides. These horrors continued until 1947, when India became independent. But the remnants of traditional social castes continue to this day and are one of the primary reasons for India's miserable positioning on the diagram. What of the land of unlimited possibilities? For years, the USA has been the richest country on earth and the most advanced in innovation and technology. Its higher education systems are global leaders, viewed as the drive behind most global trends. Simultaneously, some 40 million American citizens live in poverty, of which 18.5 million are in dire poverty, and 5.3 million have nothing. The USA is typified by the highest level of income inequality, even after taxes. The lives of Americans are shorter and they suffer more illnesses compared to people living in other wealthy democracies. The Lorenz curve calculated according to income quintiles, increments of 20%, is provided in illustration 4. This is exactly the same kind of graph as illustration 1, where Topaz was rated as the highest income earner with a huge leap ahead of the others. In other words, 20% of America's population is far wealthier than everyone else. The pale gray columns indicate income after taxes, the dark columns represent income before taxes, and the dotted line on both the right-hand columns indicates income earned by the top 1%. What's surprising is that the rich stay rich, even after taxes are deducted. In the USA, as I'm writing these words, the wealthy tend to be compensated the most. Inequality in the West. Anna's uncompromising claim that inequality is wholly and solely the result of economic competition and has no connection to social and other human phenomena derives from the perception instituted by Adam Smith, who states that competition and nothing else encourages production. But that's a simplistic approach which ignores social, political, and environmental factors. From the moment that inequality is strongly embedded, it crosses generations and not only limits resources, but opportunities, as happened in America. And that's how not only people of poorer means are harmed, but the reservoir of human capital too, and competition itself. Increasingly, the market becomes more limited based on the friend brings a friend method and nepotism, while all the friends convince themselves that they're successful by virtue of their hard work. In other words, the USA of today lacks one of the most important characteristics of equality: social mobility. Social mobility allows people to unlink from their social status and climb higher. Status fixing without true opportunities for people of the lower classes to improve their socioeconomic status translates eventually into the public fiercely feeling exploited and discriminated against. This is an extremely important point for our discussion, especially if it causes the kind of social instability we've been seeing lately. It can be demonstrated from a historical perspective. Following the fall of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929, American President Herbert Hoover instituted a policy founded on the concept of expanded consumption. His federal policy didn't succeed, and the USA entered a massive decade-long recession known as the Great Depression. This extended period of helplessness brought America's citizens to acknowledge that a very different policy was needed. The population wanted a new economic policy and sought a strong leader. Yes, the idea was in vogue back then too. This was the pervading mood when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the presidency in 1932, instituting his New Deal, a program of highly centralized economic recovery. In the framework of the new policy titled redlining, the federal government informed investment companies about neighborhoods and geographic areas that it viewed as safe investments, and those it labeled as less sound. Banks, for example, used these maps to determine their policies on providing residential mortgages. The primary guideline in determining a region's color and investment value was the local population's racial characteristics. In this way, residential areas with a multitude of minorities, Blacks, Jews, Hispanics, etc., where the quality of life was already poor, were marked as unsafe for investment. An example of such a map delineating the areas in Oakland in 1939 appears in illustration 5. The map's divisions are color-coded to indicate investment value. Dark is terrible, light is smart. Stop for a moment and think about that. Since then, and to the end of the 1960s, even in areas where the wage-earning differences between blacks and whites were negligible, people buying land in specific areas received loans under highly preferential conditions. By contrast, people seeking real estate in other areas were not entitled to mortgages and therefore were unable to buy a home. To make matters worse, since education in the USA was primarily funded by property tax, for several decades, white neighborhoods enjoyed better education than black neighborhoods. In our competitive world, this obviously has consequences for generations down the line. Inequality is evident in every sphere. A ratio of 1:2 exists between the number of white to black American families suffering from nutritional insecurity, and similar disparities exist for the number of families below the poverty line, experiencing unemployment, having a greater chance of female imprisonment, 1/6, and male imprisonment, 1/5.5, and of course in income, 1/2 to 1. So the fury expressed by blacks on the streets of America in 2020 was inflamed by numerous sources. The trigger was the police officer who choked George Floyd to death, but the masses surging through the streets weren't just protesting the way Floyd was treated. They were protesting generations of discrimination and inequality, which manifested in the most basic of civilian aspects, such as their perception of the police force's attitude towards the black minority. We can't blame all problems in black society on a color-coded map that prevented them from receiving mortgages, investments, and money for education. But it would be foolish to claim, as my friend Anna so adamantly did, that these groups just happen to be responsible for all the ignorance, crime, and laziness. By the way, redlining also occurred in other locations worldwide, but to a far smaller degree and over relatively briefer timeframes. For example, during the 1980s in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. Inequality can clearly derive from conquests and revolutions, such as in Kenya, from geographical reasons, such as in Brazil, from intentional policies, such as in the USA, and from rigid social layering, such as in India. Inequality is not a direct outcome of differences in efforts to succeed. That's why inequality continues to exist in most societies for extended periods, as we see in illustration 6. The mathematics of discrimination. Racially, religiously, or ethnically based discrimination which entrenches inequality. Where does it come from? We could perhaps claim that humans have a primeval fear of the different and the other who may threaten them. But is that all there is to the story? After all, we saw in illustration 5 that when the federal government began redlining regions, cities were already more or less split based on racial or ethnic affiliations. Professor Thomas Schelling, economist, professor of international relations, and Nobel laureate in economics, tried to build a mathematical model to explain this division. The question came to his mind because he presumed that most people were not racist to the degree that they wouldn't agree to live next to someone who wasn't a part of their group. The model, which earned Schelling the Nobel Prize 34 years later, is extremely simple. It contains two possible agent types, black and white, representing separate groups, whether different races or different ethnicities or different religions, and so on. As we see in illustration 7, each group's agents are positioned on locational matrices. This is a very simplistic way of mathematically describing the set of human social behaviors. The two populations are initially randomly located on the matrix. A cell could be populated by a black agent, a white agent, or remain empty. We can think of the value T as the degree of satisfaction an agent feels when living near similar people. Some agents are pleased with their locations, others aren't. Schelling then defined that a satisfied agent is one that is surrounded by at least T% of similar agents. For example, if for a particular black agent T equals 25%, that agent will feel satisfied if at least 1/4 of her or his neighbors are black. But if that's not the case, the agent will want to change her or his location. So we see that the greater T is, the greater the chance that the agent will be dissatisfied with her or his location. For the sake of simplicity, Schelling also defined that all agents have the same threshold value of T. That is, all agents in the game like to have agents similar to them in their vicinity, to the same relative degree. The illustration depicts a matrix resembling a chessboard with rectangular squares. The black, white, and colored squares are scattered throughout, with the white squares representing empty cells. Illustration 7 shows part of Schelling's board. Two types of agents are marked using black and gray. Empty squares are white. Let's say for a moment that T equals 50% for all agents. Look in the upper left corner at the gray agent marked with a black tick. That agent is satisfied because there are two gray neighboring agents. The black agent in the left column and marked with a white tick is also satisfied because although two gray agents are positioned above and below, two identical black agents are to the right and diagonally adjacent. By contrast, the agents marked X are not satisfied. The upper one has no similar neighbors, and the one in the second row has only one identical neighbor of the three adjacent neighbors. So the two agents marked X will likely want to move to a different location. The model presumes that dissatisfied agents will move to the most appropriate vacant position on the matrix, as we see on the checkered board on the left. In other words, they will want to move to a more satisfactory position closer to others of their own type. All dissatisfied agents move in the same round. At the end of this first round of moves, a new round begins, and dissatisfied agents keep moving until all agents are satisfied with their locations. In illustration 8, we see the results of the Schelling model dynamics, where the tendency of each agent to be near similar agents is measured at 35, 50%, and 65%, and for various densities where 9%, 20%, and 50% of the cells in the matrix are empty, which would equate to rural and urban areas. We can see that for almost every possible value, pale gray agents have gathered together, and dark agents have also grouped up, but separately. The more the wish to differentiate rises, the more visible the separation will be, up to a clear 65% of the population being completely separate. What's more surprising is that this color-based coalescence even occurs at 35%. In other words, in a situation where the agents are satisfied even when surrounded by members of the other group. Or simply put, even when an agent is fine with only a minority of the neighbors being of the agent's own color, social differentiation nonetheless occurs. The model proves that in a non-homogeneous society, even one that's interested in social diversity, some level of group-based separateness will always occur. Black America's least understood communities are those poor, hyper-segregated places we once called ghettos. These neighborhoods are not far away, but they might as well be on the moon. James Foreman Jr., human rights activist. From this point on, human psycho-emotional mechanisms will cause the groups to feel increasingly alienated from each other to the point of extremes. In professional parlance, these mechanisms are called cognitive biases. Psychology relates to several well-known and proven cognitive biases. Confirmation bias leads American teachers to punish Black students more severely. Simply stated, this is a human tendency that ascribes greater weight to a specific set of circumstances which seemingly prove a strongly rooted belief. They're more violent. That's exactly what I say about them all the time. Confirmation bias is counterbalanced by affinity bias, in which we tend to forgive those who are similar to ourselves. Affinity bias has been proven in countless studies. He isn't a violent person. I know people like him. He probably just got really angry. We're also more attentive to ideas and people who are similar to ourselves. These biases contribute to creating a non-diverse environment. They impact creativity, innovation, mood, and involvement by individuals in society. If Black students are accustomed to being punished, they'll act in ways they're expected to, which circles back to confirmation bias. See, it's happening again. I knew they were like that. And round it goes. Social research is a serious matter. Parallel to professional scientific research in the field of social sciences, which is careful about reaching conclusions and tends to advance at a heel-to-toe pace, recent years have seen psychosocial theories developing which simplify reality to the utmost and primarily sow hatred among the groups. In a study I conducted before writing up this chapter, an interesting point came to light. In a large number of studies on society, it was very evident that the researchers themselves strongly wished to prove a specific outcome. The researchers were cognitively biased, and so during their research, they tended to bypass logical and research obstacles without relating to them at all, and miraculously arrived at the wished-for conclusion. Most research of this nature indicates harsh biases against women and minorities in countless areas of life, starting with education and all the way to stereotyped language. It seems that many of these studies are fundamentally flawed at the scientific level, yet their impact on further research is no less than that of reliable studies. In short, research in the social sciences is just as contaminated by social biases. Evidently, if that's the sorry state of research, how much sorrier is the state of things in society in general? In a fabulous and humor-filled project secretly conducted by 3 researchers and titled Grievance Studies Affair, the researchers proved that in the fields of academic research known as post-colonial studies, queer studies, gender studies, and fat studies, all of which actually do exist, a subculture developed in which certain conclusions are permissible, and that researchers in these fields are interested in fortifying their claims rather than reaching any objective truth. Aiming to prove their claims, the grievance researchers sent articles to the leading journals in these fields with content so ridiculous as to draw tears of merriment. They published 7 articles in a single year, a significant success in the academic world, which among other things claimed that from the angle of research, a penis is not a male organ, and thus the penis should be analyzed as a social construct, or that the phenomenon of transphobia in men could be reduced through anal self-penetration with a vibrator. The title of one of those articles was Human Reactions to Rape Culture and Queer Performativity at Urban Dog Parks in Portland, Oregon. This article actually earned special recognition from the journal, despite the editors expressing concern over the dog's breach of privacy. The project demonstrated how influential these new radical theories were becoming, the point of the theories being to prove the relations of power between different groups in the population and ostensibly neutralize these power relations. Don't be racist. Racism is a crime and crime's black business. Online sarcasm. So the separation between populations begins when historic and geopolitical processes make society non-homogeneous as far as race, ethnic origins, religion, etc. The various population groups gather into areas with clear boundaries, whether geographic, social, and/or economic, based on the Schelling model. Cognitive biases sharpen the differences, blur the similarities, and fix the separation. And eventually critical theories add fuel to the flame by claiming hatred and discrimination under academic pretexts. But what can be done with all this? After the discussion on inequality's deficiencies and the risks it carries, we must also ask the inverse question. Is equality the desired social goal? Mahatma Gandhi said that a civilization is measured by how it treats its weakest members. But not everyone thinks, as he does, that inequality is undesirable. Firstly, it's clear that the strong members of a society feel differently from the weak members. A study run by the World Bank in 60 countries points to how consistently half those asked tend to negate the need for equality, whereas the rest view it positively. It's hard to determine the desirable degree of equality, or whether full equality can even exist. Freedom and equality are perceived as natural partners from as far back as the French Revolution. Liberté et égalité sounds like a great slogan for a new liberal political party, but are these two values really a match made in heaven? Think about this. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in Tsarist Russia also brought a message of new equality. But to assure equality, it was first necessary to ensure the Communist Party's control over all areas of political life. And that meant setting laws which involved limitations, such as the law prohibiting the use of the Arabic alphabet, the law prohibiting religious rights, and the censorship law. No more than a few years later, the censorship law erased all freedoms for USSR citizens over the next 69 years. Even full freedom will eventually cause dreadful inequality and at high speed. Increase the degree of freedom and inequality will appear full force. The strong will overwhelm, the weak will buckle, having no other choice, and social layering will reappear. The internet, discussed in depth later in this book, opened to the public in 1991 and was initially perceived as the epitome of freedom, the essence of freedom of expression, enabling access to information, protecting privacy, and the right to collect and incorporate. Everyone hung their hopes for positive social change on it. The days of being shut up were over. Long live freedom. But a mere 3 or so years later, Yahoo showed up and quickly took undisputed control over the internet. So, in a seeming state of total freedom, the internet completely changed from a place of equality to one where a single company controlled it all. In the years that followed, inequality became the internet's main characteristic. Whether desirable or not, inequality influences economic growth and social robustness, and there's no single answer to the question of how much inequality is optimal for the economy. On one hand, when inequality exists, the incentive towards improvement also exists, which positively impacts the economy. On the other hand, inequality also affects education, for example, which in turn detrimentally affects long-term growth. So far, we've related to inequality in the classical economic sense, but as mentioned, there's another type of inequality. It runs far deeper: inequality of opportunities. It's harder to measure because its scope at any given time only manifests many years later. In addition, to measure equal opportunity, A baseline of shared aspirations is needed for any population under examination, such as ambitions focusing on higher education or the wish to travel abroad, and so on. But not everyone holds the same life goals. For example, a significant part of Israel's ultra-Orthodox sector does not see achieving a law degree as anything to be proud of, since for them it's no more than an economic tool that will enable spending more time studying the Bible. By contrast, in most other sectors, this achievement is definitely a source of pride. Governments, when attempting to study and handle inequality, relate more to the economic aspect of inequality and less to inequality of opportunities. Governments employ various economic interventions towards reducing economic inequality. One approach allocates child endowments as a way of enabling a common starting point, irrespective of the parents' levels of income. The counter approach avoids granting funds as a way of forcing all capable citizens into employment. A third approach is to tax the strong layers while providing allocations for the weak layers of society. For example, an annual levy of 2% to 3% on the assets of the 119,000 wealthiest people in Britain could raise the equivalent of $57 billion. The degree of any intervention's influence is another matter. Progressive countries such as Belgium or Denmark can significantly help their societies to become more equal when it comes to citizens' gross income. But does this equality help the economy grow? Develop social cohesion? Improve happiness? Research is nowhere close to determining any of these. Nonetheless, even if we can't say precisely which policy is more suitable, the greater majority of us feel it's important to ensure that inequality doesn't bring people to abject poverty. We don't want scenarios where a wretched old woman scrabbling around in the open market's garbage as a spanking new Jeep filled with boisterous and clearly well-off youngsters passes her to be seen as normative. We find some disparities insufferable, even if we haven't studied them, which is why the issue of determining an effective policy carries significant weight. That's because it inherently rouses public sentiment. If the public or part of it views a policy as unjust, that's going to influence social stability. Leadership's efforts, no matter how honestly they're intended, aren't always able to satisfy the sense of discrimination felt by the weaker layers. Sometimes people just get fed up and start seeking a new economic and political structure, even if it means upheaval. We'll look at that in the next chapter.